The history of print media. Now that so much media is electronic or digital, it's hard to imagine there was ever a time before print media was invented. The earliest civilizations only had oral communication. If they had news to tell, they ran to the nearest person to spread the words to others, who each did the same until everyone had heard the news. Then people began to write down their news in picture form and then include languages where symbols stood for words and letters. It took the inventions of paper and the printing press for print media to come into regular use. Once it did, there was no turning back. It is important to understand how our print media evolved over time from 3500 BC, when the Sumerian used wet clay tablets, to the media that we have today, such as newspapers, books, magazines, and so much more. There have been many technological advancements and many influential people that have marked a major shift in aspects of print media, such as Johannes Gutenberg and his first printing machine, or the invention of paper by the Chinese, as well as the release of the first e-books, which marked a major turning point for print media. Throughout this section, the history and the important technological advancements will be outlined and explained for the three major categories of print media: newspapers, books, and magazines. Each of these topics and how they changed throughout the years, such as books to e-books, and newspaper companies migrating from traditional print media to publishing on online platforms. A link will be provided to an online timeline that will demonstrate the history has changed over time, as how recently a lot of our changes have taken place. But before we dwell on that, let's take up first the history of printing. A brief history of printing. Around the year 932, Chinese printers adopted wood blocks, which have been used to print illustrations and small amounts of text, and started producing popular books more easily. Each page of text was one block that could be used repeatedly to make the books. About 100 years later, China's Bi Sheng invented movable type by carving individual characters onto small blocks of clay. Each small block was hardened by fire to become a porcelain piece that could be used again and again. The pieces were glued to iron plates to make a page. Using each page hundreds or thousands of times, he could mass-produce news quickly. When the printing was done, the pieces were removed from the plates to be used again to make the other pages. Bi Sheng's invention had limited success in China because the Chinese alphabet characters are so large that they were difficult to put on movable type. His idea spread all over the world. However, others adopted it using other materials such as wood, tin, and copper. Still, the process was too cumbersome to mass-produce a newspaper for the public. The invention of printing press. Johannes Gutenberg, a German inventor, printer, publisher, and goldsmith, invented the printing press in 1451. His work started the printing revolution in Europe and is regarded as a milestone of the second millennium, ushering in the modern period of human history. It played a key role in the development of the Renaissance, a period in European history marking the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity and covering the 15th and 16th centuries. His invention was a game changer. It opened lines of communication throughout the world. The advent of printing press changed the face of journalism and education. Like the internet 5 centuries later, the printing press's influence altered the way people learned, shared knowledge, spread opinions, and amused themselves. Its effects include the impact of the printing press on education, for example. It vastly increased the number of people who learned to read. However, issues about pollution surrounding modern industrial printing and paper manufacturing have developed since Gutenberg's revelatory invention. The culmination of toxic ink and bleaches used by some modern manufacturers can have adverse effects on the surrounding environment. The first mechanical printing press was a culmination of ideas: the manufacturing of paper from rags, metal type, and oil-based inks. Development in printing began in Europe sometime during the late 1300s and early 1400s. Trade among European capitals and Asia introduced inventors in Europe to new method of paper manufacturing using discarded rags, a much cheaper process than the calfskin formerly used in the West. The first printed and bound books were concerned with religious topics. They were large, expensive, and heavy. They were mostly used in religious ceremonies such as family heirlooms. Aldus Manutius, a Venetian printer, printed the first small, portable books in 1482. The accessibility and portability of the pocket books helped the spread of literacy. The history of newspapers. The newspapers we see and read today have come a long way. First, dating back to the BCE era. Significant events mark different turning points in the evolution of newspapers, which first started out as pamphlets or sheets of paper with little publications and very irregular schedules. Slowly, the newspaper industry changed as more people got involved. Once noticing their growing popularity and necessity as a form of communication for current events, the news and entertainment. As newspaper changes, people and companies starting to change as well as trying to keep up with the current times while also progressing. One of the first documented considered newspapers came from Julius Caesar, a journal that contained daily events called Acta Diurna in 59 BCE. This was a very small starting point for what was to come for newspapers, but kick-started the industry. From there, the first official newspaper that was printed was in Beijing, China in 748 BCE. Over time, newspapers came in forms of rags or on sheets of paper that took copious amounts of time and did not reach many people. The World Association of Newspapers considers the first newspaper to be The Relation, which was published in Germany in 1604. It was published regularly or weekly, disseminated to the public, and covered a range of news from politics to entertainment. The Oxford Gazette was the first English paper to be established starting in 1665. It moved to London the next year and was renamed the London Gazette. It is still published today as the official publication of government news. Although the early American colonists published news sheets, the first true newspaper was published in Boston in 1690 called Public Occurrences. Both foreign and domestic ran into trouble for publishing political criticism. Its publisher, Benjamin Harris, was arrested and all copies were destroyed. While the American colonists were adamant about freedom of religion, freedom of the press was another matter. The first successful newspaper in America was the Boston Newsletter in 1702. Too pricey for the public. Ironically, the early mass-produced newspapers cost close to the salary that most workers earned in a week, so only the wealthy could afford to buy them. Wealthy people were more likely to be literate at that time too. In the 1830s, this changed when steam-powered presses were first introduced, replacing the original hand-powered press. This allowed 4,000 sheets of paper per hour to be printed, double-sided. Then officially, in 1833, the penny press was introduced, being sold for only 1 cent and immediately circulating to 8,000 people. After this evolution, production and distribution of newspapers really started to take off. The prices of newspapers also started to rise when the interest peaked and the people started to recognize this as an industry rather than a hobby. By 1900, newspapers were very popular because more people were literate and papers were affordable. They included the features we recognize today, including attention-grabbing headlines, news, society pages, sports, comics, and the occasional use of spot color in special instances. The rise of the newspaper. From the 1830s and on is when newspapers really started to be introduced. Many different kinds from many different places. The New York Herald, the New York Tribune, and the New York Times were introduced. With the rise of many newspapers, there came a lot of discussion. People were now able to get their news, events, and entertainment in a new form than they were used to. With this also came many new journalists and reporters, as the need for them increased. In 1873, the New York Press Club was introduced, becoming the first formally organized press club for journalists to gather, discuss, and criticize each other's work. The New York Press Club is still around today, functioning the same as it was before. From this point, many factors started to come into play for newspapers as technology develops and the audience desires news more than ever. Advances and changes. Now newspapers have been around for a while and commonality of them being distributed daily has sunk in. People are getting their information about what is going on their daily lives and the world surrounding them. Journalism started to make a change as yellow journalism reached its height in the 1880s. This means that the news being reported on was based on faulty assessments and exaggerations rather than the truth and facts. This changes in the 1890s to 1900s as more and more journalists started to gain experience in scientific fields. Rather than their reports being story-based, they became fact-based, giving their audiences more important and relevant information. Another important advancement in the newspaper industry that is still around today is the American Newspaper Publishers Association. This is the cohesion of advertising and newspapers as they started to form what would be a lasting relationship. After a couple of years, the American Newspaper Publishers Association has started to regulating commissions, standardizing advertising rates, and publishing a list of approved ad agencies. This became a necessity as advertising in a newspaper started to have a more involved role than before. With the many changes that took place throughout the history of newspapers, it was crucial that journalists were also keeping up. That is why the National Press Club was introduced in 1908. It was the world's leading professional organization for journalists and is still around today. It helps journalists improve their skills in meeting the changes of global communication that took place while also building a worldwide community for this media. In 1933, the Guild was also another advancement for newspapers as it established a union for publications and editorial personnel.